Welcome to the Real Bible Rob podcast. And today I would like to focus on the names of Jesus that we see in Isaiah 9:6. And we're really familiar with these because they are spoken at Christmas time every year. It comes from the Messiah. Handel's Messiah has the great oratorio. And these words look like four different names for Jesus: Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. So today I'd like to go through these in Hebrew and walk through them, and you can see that they have a kind of a different feel, and that these are actually more like one name. When you look at it as one name, kind of in an indigenous sense. So for Christmas Eve, I'll go through this with the congregation, but I'd like to go through it maybe a little more detail with you. In Hebrew, these are these four things: Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, and Prince of Peace. In Hebrew, it's Pehleh yoehtz, El gaboor, avee, shalom. And the reason why we can look at these together will become apparent as I go through it. Now, the first line is Pehleh yoehtz in Hebrew. Pehleh means miraculous, marvelous, wonderful. And it's acting as an adjective, and it modifies the next word, which is yoehtz. Yoehtz is actually a verb, but in this construct, it's acting as a participle, which is a verb that acts like a noun, or an adjective, but in this case, a noun. And in this case, or as a verb, yoehtz is advise or to counsel. And when it's translated here, it looks like counselor, someone who counsels. And that's a good and useful construct. But you can kind of look at it a little bit differently when you look at it in Hebrew. And probably the best example of this, and I'll show this here for those of you who are looking at, is that if you look at the JPS, which is the Jewish Publication Society Tanakh, this is the Hebrew Bible in both Hebrew and in English, and it's the sort of the standard for Hebrew speakers, and Jewish people use this as their reference for their Bible. And when you look at it in here, it actually translated a little bit differently. It actually translates it as the mighty God, a mighty God, is planning marvelous things. So they keep the verb form of yoehtz. And it sounds a lot like an indigenous name, doesn't it? Instead of Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God is planning marvelous things as a name. And you can see how it's filled with a sense of promise in this sense, just by keeping that verbal form. Now the next line, so that's these two lines put together. So Mighty God is El gaboor. And that's a more straightforward, because El is God in Hebrew. In this case, it sounds more like El, but El. Gaboor just means mighty or strong or powerful. So that really fits together. So it's when you put these two things together, Pehleh yoehtz, El gaboor, that's how you get this mighty God who's doing something, planning, counseling, advising wonderful things. The next line is avee. And this actually is pretty clear too, because avee comes from av. Av means father. Avraham. We're very used to that. Abraham. Avraham. Avraham is the father of nations. And so avee, and then yad. Yad is sort of a particle, but it means forever. We say everlasting or eternal. And so you put this together, avee means the eternal Father, the everlasting Father. And again, that's pretty straightforward. The final line, sar shalom. Now, sar means commander. In Hebrew, anyone who's in the battlefield, like David, was a sar. This idea of somebody who's strong, powerful, a leader. Shalom is something that we know very well. I mean, shalom means peace. And not just sort of like, peace be with you, peace, but peace in this deep, settling peace, this peace of mind, this completeness, wholeness. So isn't it interesting? A word that's a military word, a very powerful word, sar, is coupled with shalom, peace. So instead of being the violent kind of commander, maybe like King David was, Jesus, or the ideal king that Isaiah is talking about, is the commander who is peaceful. So again, if we pull these two together, we get Eternal Father who rules in peace. So instead of being, again, like two separate things, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, we get combined, we get something that, again, sounds a lot more like an indigenous name. And that is Eternal Father who rules in peace. So in the King James Version, which is where we get, Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, sounding like four separate names, they're very regal. And it makes a lot of sense because if you know the history of the King James Bible, where it comes from, why it was commissioned by King James, it was basically a political move in order to establish the Protestant Bible. Well, and you can see this in many of the word choices in the King James Version, and that is where these names are brought, or these regal-sounding names, kingly names are brought, and this is just a prime example of that. But again, when you read it more in Hebrew and in the Jewish sense, you get more this sense of that sounds like an indigenous name. And it's very useful for this reason. So that's why I like to say that when you read this, you're really hearing something that's maybe not even two indigenous names, but a whole one name. And that would be Mighty God who's planning marvelous things is the Eternal Father who rules in peace. That's who the ideal king is. So let's talk about that for a second. Was Isaiah focusing on talking about Jesus? Well, Isaiah, 500 to 600 years before Jesus, was talking about King Hezekiah and the promise of a new king coming, a king who would be ideal, would rule the people in truth and grace. And so that was sort of the immediate context of this. Now, of course, Isaiah is describing the ideal king, what we hope for, what we hope God will bring to us. And of course, when Jesus came and in the Gospels, immediately they go, oh, well, obviously the ideal king was already described by Isaiah and was then used for this. Handel, when writing the Messiah, the great oratorio, he wrote it in English. He's a German guy, but he lived in England, and he was writing it for the kings, for King George. When he wrote that, he picked up this line from the King James Version. Actually, it even looks like 5 names when he does that because there's a comma between Wonderful and Counselor in the King James Version. But, these names, and he raises them, with trumpets and choirs and, strings and just this beautiful sense of this powerful sounding or uh, chorus. So that's why it lives so deeply within us, and that's why we associate it with Jesus even more than it's described in the Gospels. Whereas the Gospels look at it, go, oh, well, Isaiah was talking about the ideal king. The ideal king is Jesus Christ. Here you go. And then, of course, in the Messiah, that gets just cemented into place. And that's why we think of it this way. And that's good, in my opinion. But I think we lose something when we look at these names in this very high-minded, this very imperial sounding way, rather than stepping back a little bit and learning and thinking about this as, like I said, as an indigenous name that's much more inviting. That is, mighty God is planning marvelous things because the eternal Father rules in peace. And you can see the irony of this. Also, what we're seeing in Hebrew here is something called antithetic parallelism. And parallelism is when they repeat things. Sometimes they're repeated to reinforce. Sometimes they're repeated. A line is repeated to contrast. Sometimes it's just to there are various kinds of parallelism, but let's put it that way. And in Hebrew makes use of this as a poetic device throughout the Old Testament. One of the beauties of reading the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures in Hebrew, is you can see how it has this parallel view. Especially this part of Isaiah, you really see it. You also see it in many of the Psalms. And you can just see how they're often rhyming. They have the same meter and rhythm. Sounds a lot like, when you read Shakespeare. How you get that amazing rhythm, or Shakespearean sonnets, for example. You can see sort of a parallelism there. The Hebrew Bible's filled with it, and it's one of the it's just gorgeous. If you ever get a chance to go to a synagogue and hear prayers in synagogue, they have this rhythm and this sound to them, and it's just wonderful. So that's why I keep talking about it as an indigenous sounding name. There is something called the First Nations version of the New Testament, and I'll show you that for those of you who are seeing in video. The First Nations version of the New Testament, and I'll read this in worship actually on Christmas Eve, has this where it assigns these indigenous sounding names to the biblical characters. It's really valuable to do because what that does is it helps us remove ourselves from a lot of the assumptions that we grew up learning about these characters. So what it does is it allows us to see the story in a fresh light, in a new way, kind of like we're hearing it for the first time. So I really recommend, if you haven't seen this, take a look at it, the First Nations version. It's wonderful. Someday I hope they come out with an Old Testament. If they do, then we could see even more of this. But again, Hebrew is, it's kind of like this tribal language. It was spoken around campfires. It has a very long verbal, oral tradition. So it makes sense that you can give names and the name of Christ. So this is why I find great comfort in this. Because instead of Jesus being far away with these huge, powerful names, which we're so used to, it's just something much quieter, simpler, more filled with promise. Mighty God is planning marvelous things because the eternal Father rules in peace. The antithetic parallelism is that mighty God is also involved with us, planning marvelous things for us. Eternal Father, who has all of this power, rules in peace. the Sar, shalom. What could be better for Christmas? What represents Christmas better than this, in my opinion? This is great. The Father of the universe, the God of the universe, is in the form of a weak child, a newborn, in a manger, in a feeding trough, born to a woman, a real woman who felt pain, who struggled, who doubted, who worried, and to a supportive father who's, we believe, is a surrogate father in our beliefs, in our tradition. He didn't have to be there to support her. He didn't have to take a subordinate background role, but he does. Why? Because he loves Mary. He loves God. He loves the child that's coming. What a beautiful Christmas message this is. So with this, I would say, I would ask you, step back a little bit. Step back from the big grand images, the swirling violins, the trumpets, the big choirs for Christmas. Instead, stand back and just look for a moment at these words in Hebrew. Pehleh yoehtz, gaboor, avee shalom. And with this, I thank you for spending the time with me once again, because people say lots of things about the Bible that aren't really there. I wish you peace.